Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to another episode of the Talk Room series of podcasts, where we look at the question of how to be your best self. We do that by looking at mental health and well-being and how this applies to people's daily lives. For those people who have not yet seen any of our previous podcasts, I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Ian. Ian is a senior accredited member of the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society and the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services. So a warm welcome to you, Ian.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you as always. And to introduce you, Wendy, a highly experienced CBT psychotherapist. You've been working in private practice, but have been involved more generally in the area of mental health and well-being for well over 30 years now. So a warm welcome to you as always. And today we have Simon joining us. Simon is a member of the Hope team. He's also a person-centered counsellor in private practice. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you onto the podcast as well, Simon.
Oh no, thank you so much, Ian and Wendy, for having me on here. I've listened to some of the other episodes actually, and I have to say I've really enjoyed them. There's just some really great content in them that almost the kind of stuff I want to bookmark and listen to again. I also want to thank Hope as an organisation. Like you say, I'm one of the counsellors on the team with Hope, and originally I started there just offering lower cost counselling, but it was Hope that gave me the motivation to step out into opening my own private practice, and they've supported me to work with many different people over the years.
And it's really great to have you today, Simon, to join us. So thank you so much for that. So today we're here to delve into a really incredibly important subject about death anxiety and death anxiety in counselling. So if we can use that awareness of our own mortalities more positively.
Wonderful. So, Simon, I understand that this is a subject that comes up a lot in the work that you do, in the counselling work that you do. So I wonder if we can just start by you just telling us a little bit more about death anxiety from a medical perspective, maybe when it might be something that clients ought to be thinking about seeking support for.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So the reason I wanted to speak on this topic of death anxiety was because as a counsellor, I've noticed a big rise in the number of people looking for counselling because of that preoccupation with death, and whether that's their own death or the death of a significant other in their lives. Being aware of our own mortalities is actually a healthy thing. It protects us from taking risks and gives us perspective in life. And I'm actually hoping to say in this talk that navigating death anxiety can even enrich your life. But first off, let's take a bit more time to think about what we mean by death anxiety from that medical perspective you ask about. So, death anxiety can be an issue for us when those thoughts of death are both invasive and distracting. In terms of a medical diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, there's not a death anxiety disorder, but it does fit within specific phobias, generalized anxiety disorders, and panic disorders. Specifically, if you're listening to this podcast and you're worrying if death anxiety is an issue that you'd like to get some support with, it could be worth asking yourself these 7 questions. So firstly, how long have thoughts about death been invasive and distracting for you? And if it's been for 6 months or more, maybe it's time to think about getting some support. Secondly, to what extent are you finding those thoughts distracting and preventing you being able to live your normal life? Maybe it's a fleeting thought or a philosophical puzzling, or maybe those thoughts are really taking up a lot of your headspace. Third, are you finding yourself easily triggered into thoughts about death? For example, when you're watching telly or you walk by a churchyard, being triggered likely feels quite out of your control and you might even worry about it. Fourth, when you experience thoughts around death, is it always with that sense of panic or anxiety, really fearing to the full extent of a word fear? Five, are you noticing that death anxiety is presenting itself physically in the body? For example, with panic attacks, or you may be often Googling to see if you have a health condition because of a ache, lump, or pain somewhere. Six, are you structuring your life so that you're avoiding these specific triggers of death anxiety? And this could be people, but it could also be places. And finally, does death anxiety lead to intrusive thoughts about taking your own life or of hurting yourself?
Yeah. And thank you for those really important questions, Simon. And I imagine that some of those questions may have resonated with a few of our viewers. So thank you very much for that. And again, if people do want to reach out, contact somebody such as yourself, people can do it through the Hope website, or just call us directly. 07379 538 411. But we'll go into that a little more in a little bit more detail later on.
Okay. Thank you, Ian and Simon, for that information. It's really, really helpful. My question is how might a counsellor support someone on an individual basis to work with death anxiety, Simon?
Yeah. So a counsellor will really recognise that death anxiety will present itself uniquely with each individual. So I'm really glad you talk about an individual basis, Wendy. But maybe we could go with some questions that might be explored within the counselling work itself. So firstly, what is it that you are thinking about specifically in relation to death anxiety? And that might be the death of yourself, the death of a loved one. It might be wondering what happens after death, or puzzling out what ceasing to exist might be like. It could be what we call meaning making, or existential issues around purpose in life. Or maybe it's more about the process of death itself, of aging, or the lack of control we can feel. And so counselling itself, it can help us find if there are also any underlying beliefs underpinning this fear of death. For example, my life is insignificant. And then if we can challenge those beliefs, or maybe we can even change and adapt them slightly. Counselling can provide a gradual exposure to things that might really trigger us, but it's done within the safety of a therapeutic relationship.
Mm.
It can boost our self-esteem. Self-esteem has this big protective factor against anxiety, and counselling can do that. It can help us to process, and that could be processing trauma or near-death experiences, maybe bereavements or other things that trigger death anxiety in you. It can help you to engage and connect with the prospect of your own death, demystifying ideas around death, or developing what we call continuing bonds, relationships with significant people who have died. Counselling can also help in finding how that thought of death anxiety presents physically in the body. And if it is presenting in something like panic attacks or overwhelm, your counsellor can help you to feel regulated in the session with you, or to practice self-soothing techniques or mindfulness that Hope's so famous for. And finally, there's a companionship that comes from connecting with a counsellor. And that companionship, that kind of intimacy, can bring a relief to issues such as death anxiety.
Okay, thank you, Simon. That again was really, really helpful. And it's really useful to get an idea of what therapy might look like on this topic. So thank you for that, especially when the unknown is such a big part of death anxiety, I believe. So you said that there's been a big rise in people looking for counselling for death anxiety. Could you say a little bit more why this might be?
Yes, yeah, I'd love to. We live in a really interesting time in history. We are more connected than we've ever been. I mean, I can literally get my mobile, open it up and read about stuff that's happening on the other side of a world that I have absolutely no control of, just at the swipe of a screen. And that feels really normal to us, to be bombarded with notifications about world events without really taking time to pause and think about the content we consume. So let's just take a moment to consider the magnitude of information passing through our brains, particularly if we look through news channels, and let's think about how we don't really process or embody those realities. Of these big existential threats on our screen, we don't really process it. So 5 years ago, 2019 to 2024, we've experienced 2 years of lockdown and the constant fear of a COVID pandemic. We were told of infection rates, the NHS being at capacity, death tolls, and even now we hear regular stories of the fallout from COVID. I personally had it again only a week or two ago. We've had and we continue having major wars in places like Gaza, Ukraine, or the threats of nuclear testing in North Korea. We hear of major climate disasters, burning forests in the Amazon or Australia, and we're told of a continual threat of global temperature rises that we're powerless to stop. And our queen who ruled for 70 years, she almost seemed eternal. She died at 96. And this is just death. Like, picture the big existential threats around us. You know, the massive cost of living crisis we've gone through, a rise of AI, Brexit, and very topical, this change in our political landscape even now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that, Simon. That's really interesting. I'm glad to see that the COVID has passed and that you've recovered well from that as well. But I can absolutely see how that information we just passively seem to absorb about the threat of death could really affect us without us ever realizing the significance or the impact of that. It's like we open ourselves up to snippets that show our lives have a time limit. And it makes sense why there's been this increase over the last 5 years in people seeking counselling around death anxiety, just for all the reasons that you've given.
Absolutely, Ian. And I suppose I notice how those news stories are said in such a factual reporting style, aren't they? Almost as though it's cultural for us to have this distant relationship with disaster. What do you think about that, Simon?
Yeah. I'm thanks, Wendy. I'm actually glad you mentioned culture as well, because it kind of brings me on to British culture and death in general. It kind of highlights this incongruence between what's reported to us about death and our day-to-day experience of it. So in Western society, we're unlikely to encounter a dead body. I mean, our funerals, they're closed caskets. An ambulance takes people away to a morgue after they've died, and death's uncommon. We fear it, but the Office of National Statistics tells us that the 2022 life expectancy was about 80 years old. So we actually live a fairly long time and don't encounter death that much on a day-to-day basis. Benjamin Franklin had his famous quote of, in this world, there's nothing certain except for death and taxes, and yet our culture is inherently death-denying. The old days of putting your curtains down to show you're grieving, Victorian mourning etiquette, those are long gone. There's almost this cultural expectation that bereavements just aren't spoken about after a funeral. And so there's a loneliness for the bereaved. Even our grief for significant people in our lives is almost silenced before the end of the first anniversary.
Absolutely, Simon. I very good points you just made there. And I'm wondering, how does that affect a person psychologically? Knowing, on one hand, that we will all die, being presented with death across all our media, and even seeing people close to us die, yet at the same time, culturally denying the existence of death or only talking about it in a very matter-of-fact way. What do you think about that, Simon?
Yeah. I think it can present in panic, terror, dread, this big existential fear. So we're both acutely denying death whilst at the same time being deeply aware of it as this threat to us and all our loved ones. I mean, for a lot of people who are experiencing death anxiety, to make matters worse, they feel it really viscerally in the body. And the resemblance the resemblance to panic attacks is interesting. So let's talk a bit about panic attacks and heart attacks. You see, when we have a panic attack, we might experience visceral symptoms like sweating, strong heart palpitations, dizziness, a sense of dread, panic, and dissociation. And these panic attacks, that they're stress, they're mental, they're a mental overwhelm symptom, but the feeling of panic attacks can be very reminiscent of having a heart attack. We can literally feel like we're going to die. So a person of death anxiety may be experiencing these waves of preoccupation, both thinking and trying to puzzle out the mystery of death, but they might be experiencing that overwhelm in the body as well. Those thoughts we so desperately try to suppress and push down, they keep emerging and they hurt us both viscerally and emotionally.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I totally agree. I can see how panic attacks can be so more threatening if you're suffering from death anxiety at the same time. And Sam, you spoke earlier about how a counsellor might work with death anxiety. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you, as a counsellor, might help people if a person presents with panic attacks?
Yeah, curiously. So when someone says they're experiencing death anxiety, I feel curious. Where in the body do they feel it? What's it like to be overwhelmed with panic? How do they experience their anxiety of death? When does it crop up? What thoughts, what questions are there? What specifically is it? What is it? What is it they're anxious about? Can we kind of experience that panic together in the counselling session whilst keeping ourselves safe? See, the mind and body, they're sort of traumatized by this existential threat. And as a counselor, I feel really curious about the message that's being spoken so strongly in a person's thoughts and experience. When we're at the gym, we lift a heavy weight and then our muscles get tired and we need to relax them before the next set. Can we use therapy? Can we use counselling a little bit like we're doing deadlifting? Excuse the pun. So deadlifting those weights of existential dread until we can tolerate those thoughts more. And just like being at the gym, having a counsellor spot you and help to encourage and manage weights can help us to lift those weights of death anxiety that feel a little bit too challenging.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I really like that. I really like that analogy of deadlifting at the gym. That metaphor to building resilience to that overwhelming panic that you describe. And I wonder, staying with that analogy, what getting stronger actually looks like.
Thanks, Ian. That's actually the beauty of therapy, because it's more than just tolerating the weight of death anxiety. It's about getting stronger from enduring that deadlifting. There's a word for it. We call it post-traumatic growth. And so we've looked at death anxiety as something that's a heavy weight to be endured, but let's picture what awareness of our own mortality might bring from a growth perspective, how we can become aware of our mortality, make friends with it, and even embrace life with a time limit. How might that look for us? Well, firstly, procrastination. Imagine there's something you've been putting off, a future dream or a task, and this might be something small like an essay if you're a student, or maybe something bigger like a transition, e.g. in a career or asking someone to marry you or deciding to have a child. Now, if there's a time limit and we're comfortable, we can keep deferring that decision. But imagine that essay needs to be handed in by next week. That dream job has just been advertised, or your biological clock is pressuring you. Then suddenly we don't have room to procrastinate. And the same opportunity exists with death anxiety. So much so that there's actually a phrase in Latin, memento mori, excuse my pronunciation, memento mori, it means remember you'll die. And that phrase reflects on this time limit. Memento mori helps us to embrace those tasks we need to do rather than just deferring them. Secondly, meaning. If life has a time limit, then memento mori, and we can reflect on meaning in our lives. We won't live forever. There's a finite time and a finite amount we can do. So some questions on meaning. Are we nurturing the relationships that are important to us, or has that just got forgotten in the rat race? What gives our life value and purpose? And are we aligned with those values, or do we need to make some alterations? And what different aspects are there to ourself? Our physical aspects, emotional, spiritual, relational, aspiration. Is there an aspect that we've neglected or maybe needs rebalancing? Finally, mindfulness and gratitude. So memento mori, we say that, then we can say that we only really ever live in this moment. And this moment becomes more significant because it's all we really have. Our days are numbered, and we can grow an appreciation for each day as a unique opportunity. Today, it's not just another day, but the only time we will ever really live is this moment, a chance to change the future we have left. And so I say to you both dramatically, and to the listeners, memento mori.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's really encouraging you to hear your wisdom and your thoughts on this area. Not just what it might be like to have the weight of death anxiety actually lifted, but also how we can actually grow from our awareness of our own mortalities. So, Simon, you mentioned Hope earlier as a place for professional help. As the founder of Hope, would you like to say anything more, Ian, if people listen to this podcast and are now looking for help?
Yeah, so organisations such as Hope Therapy and Counselling regularly work with a whole variety of mental health and wellbeing needs, including death anxiety. We have people such as Simon, but others as well. People are very, very welcome to contact us. And we have people who work with people right the way around the country. We have people operating nationwide. So take a look at the website. There's lots and lots of free resources on there. A team of very, very experienced counsellors. People can take a look at www.hopefulminds.co.uk. That's www.hopefulminds.co.uk. And as well as being in the team here at Hope, Simon, you also mentioned that you have your own private practice. So maybe just tell the listeners a tiny little bit about that as well.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I mean, you can contact Hope, and if you contact Hope, you can work with me that way or one of the other really experienced counsellors on the team. You're also right, I do have my own private practice. It's based in central Oxford, or I do a lot of work through phone or video, much like we're talking to each other now. You can visit my website as well. I've written articles on a number of things like this, and that's www.simonslistening.co.uk. You can also find me on YouTube at Simon's Listening and Facebook at Simon's Listening Counselling Services. I recently released a YouTube video on procrastination, so actually if that element of memento mori appeals to you, then feel free to check it out.
And of course, you too, Wendy, a hugely, hugely experienced CBT psychotherapist. You work with people regarding a whole variety of different presentations, including death anxiety. So maybe just tell people a little bit about yourself and how they might get hold of you as well.
Yes, thank you for that, Ian. Certainly. So my website is called www.wendycastellino.com. That's wendycastellino.com. And there's lots of free resources on there, meditations, courses, handouts, blogs, and also have a YouTube channel as well. Wendy Castellino 798. So you can find various content on there. So any questions you have, please feel free to contact me via that website. But I really want to give a warm thank you, Simon, for your topic today. It was fascinating and very, very interesting. So thank you so much for being our guest. And also, I want to thank everyone for listening. And please feel free to tune into our next podcast episode, where I believe you'll be returning, Simon.
Yes, yeah, it's a topic close to my heart. The next episode's going to be on sensory sensitivities, so do tune in then. Also, if as the listener, if you're watching this maybe on YouTube, for example, I would really love to read any comments if you comment on this video on what awareness of your own mortality means to you. Genuinely, be fascinated to read them. I will add a disclaimer to just be aware of confidentiality. Anything we post on socials, on YouTube, etc., is out in the public domain. But thank you for listening, and I look forward to catching you on the next episode.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Wendy. Bye-bye for now.